Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am your host, Egberto Willies. This is a progressive program that will take the mystery out of politics. This is the program that will encourage you to make sure government becomes we the people. Whether you are liberal, progressive, conservative, or otherwise, you get to air your point of view. We are an independent media outlet that, unlike mainstream media beholden to corporations, we only owe allegiance to you. Remember, you can also send me a tweet at EGBERTOWILLIES. That is at Egberto Willies. Let us engage. It is Politics Done Right. Well, folks, welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. I'm Egberto Willies, your host. Thank you so kindly for being part of the show. We are going to have a great show for you today. Today we have the one and only Thom Hartmann in the house. But anyway, how are my peeps doing? Alistair Waters is in the house. E2247 is in the house. Breach MCP is in the house. Let's see, who else is in the house? AV Cube, Michael Rudnin is in the house. Where are all my peeps this afternoon? Did our emails go out or not? Did those flyers go out automatically or not? You know, sometimes when you have a lot of automation to kind of, you know, when they talk about AI, it's all automation, folks. It's all automation. And is it out? Or is our automation out? Yep, it just went out. Alistair Keelan is in the house. Good afternoon. Good evening, Alistair Keelan. I think I'm seeing you for the second time, so you're going to see. I don't know if you stayed for the whole thing on El Señor Hartmann, Thom Hartmann, but we're going to play Thom Hartmann because, you know, we think everybody should be listening to what he has to say about democracy. May Wood just joined us as well. May, welcome to Politics Done Right. Those online that aren't checked in yet, welcome aboard. I see you here. Why don't you just make your presence known with a chat or something. Peggy Lopez is in the house. ¿Cómo estás, mi amiga? Says, happy to see Egberto and Thom in his discussion. How exciting we're going to have it. And we're going to start it right in a few minutes. I'm just waiting a little bit more for more people to join in before I go ahead and lay it out. Bridge MCP says, Egberto Willies, Cornel West. Why is he running, splitting the vote with the group No Labels? Those guys that are doing that, they are sick. You know, let me tell you something about elitists. Elitists, they think one way and one way only. You know, I mean, there are some people who some people can say, we don't like this particular candidate, so therefore we're just going to vote third party, or we're just going to do this, right? And if the wrong person wins, as far as their personal economy is concerned, their own finances, their own economics, it would be fine. But that's not the case. There are some people who, when certain people win, it materially harms their families. It hurts them. And that's what I try to tell those of us who are on the progressive side that are unhappy with the several things that Biden has done. I would say, you know what? I understand. But if we progressives want the right kind of candidates, we have to work that much harder than everybody else to get them into the primaries so that they can ultimately win. But if we don't get them to ultimately win, our only choice is the best of both worlds, or rather, the least evil that can affect us. That's the only choice. So what some of these guys are doing is completely elitist, and not only elitists run the risk of hurting the least of us. And one of the things that I intend to do with my activism is always to think of the least of us. And there are times that I want to stick it to them. But because I don't also want to hurt the least of us, I understand that it cannot be done. I understand we have to redouble and work harder. And that applies to all of us in the progressive space. We have to work that much harder. You know, it's hard to say, but we have to work that much harder. But anyway, without further ado, let me see anybody else I need to salute. Anyway, let's go ahead and get Thom Hartmann started, and then we'll come back with the rest of the story. Remember that thing? The rest of the story. All right, Let's go ahead and bring Thom Hartmann into the fold, and then we'll continue after Thom. Go ahead, Thom. Welcome to one more edition of Politics and Right. I'm Egberto Willies, your host. Today, we are honored once again to speak to the one and only Thom Hartmann, the progressive radio host. I call it progressive radio host extraordinaire. Thom Hartmann is a four-time winner of the Project Censored Award, a New York Times bestselling author of more than 33 books. How much is it up to right now?
I don't know.
All right. I just wanted to break in with that. Anyway, he's America's #1 progressive talk show host. His show is syndicated on local for-profit and nonprofit stations and broadcast nationwide and worldwide, including at our station here, KPFT 90.1 FM Houston. It is also simulcast on Holmes, www.hiddenhistorybooks.com. Anyway, today we are here to discuss quite a bit, but Thom, welcome to Politics Done Right again.
Hey, Egberto, it's great to be back with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, let me tell you, what we are here to discuss, again, another one of your impressive books. I've not been able to read it word for word, but just the table of contents and otherwise tells us that it's yet another misread. It covers a lot of things, folks, that we've covered right through this entire program with regards to our democracy, and it's called The Hidden History of American Democracy, in which Thom covered quite a bit. That it is apropos in these times, especially with what we hope, Donald Trump, the American traitor, hopefully going to jail. Anyhow, Senor, how are you doing today? Why did you write this book? And I know it's a silly question, but our audience wants to know.
No, it's a great question. I wrote the book because there are so many misconceptions, many of which are being promoted or exploited by right-wingers about the foundation of this country. Right-wingers saying we're a Christian nation. We're not. That the founders wanted it to be a Christian nation. They didn't. That democracy is an abnormal thing, they say, and it's just an idea somebody came up with. And really, we can kind of set it aside and just make Donald Trump emperor and everything will be fine. That's more normal, 1,000 years of history in Europe. That's not true. Democracy is actually our default state. The theory that the Constitution was written exclusively for rich white men to protect their wealth, an idea that rich white men love to promote, but it's not true. There's a bunch of myths bubbles that I wanted to burst, as it were, myths that I wanted to pop with this book, and I think I hope I've done a good job of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I went through it, and it was like, wow, he touches on everything. First of all, let me tell you, the David Cobb, a friend of mine, I think a friend of just about everybody in the progressive space, and who ran once for president of the United States. Once we had a long night discussion. He said the Constitution is nothing more than a capital document. I want to start there. Is that something that you could agree with?
Well, if you define capital as private property, yeah, the Constitution does acknowledge, private property and protect it in some ways. But back in the 1920s, in 1929, actually, Charles Beard and Mary Beard, his wife, they were professors of history at Columbia University. He was a Marxist, he was a socialist. She was a Marxist. And they published what was probably the best-selling American history during that period from the 1930s to the 1950s, called, The History of the United States, from a Marxist economic analysis point of view. Beard also wrote a book called An Economic Analysis of the Constitution, making that argument. And in 1956, Forrest McDonald, a historian and scholar, decided that he would see, was there any truth to this? Going back to, what was the intent of the people who wrote it? Who were the people who wrote it? And what was the intent of the people who ratified the Constitution? And what he found was that, first off, the wealthiest of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, there were a number of people who owned a lot of land. Jefferson and Washington, for example, but land was cheap then. You just stole it from the Indians. And it really wasn't a measure of wealth. In fact, in many ways, it was a kind of a ball and chain. You had to work the land, and there were obligations, and in some cases, even taxes. Jefferson died in bankruptcy. George Washington could not afford to free the slaves that he had promised to free on his death. His estate was gone within a generation. James Madison, his family could only hold on to his estate for about a couple of decades after his death. None of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence left any multi-generational wealth of consequence, and none of them left multi-generational wealth that lasted more than 2 generations. There were no Rockefellers, there were no DuPonts or Morgans or like that among the founders. There were people of that kind of wealth during the founding generation. The Johnson family up on the Hudson River had a massive castle with 300 European retainers who wore knights' suits of armor and things. There were some just obscenely rich people in the United States. Virtually all of them got their wealth from their connections to either the British royal family or the East India Company. And all of them pretty much left the country during the Revolutionary War. The Johnson family fled to Canada, for example. So the wealthiest of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock, and his wealth in today's dollars was around $700,000. He was, so first off, what we're talking about is the upper middle class, not the morbidly rich of the era. That was the Declaration. You look at the Constitution. The people who helped write the Constitution, there were no genuinely rich people among that crowd. There were a lot of lawyers. There were a lot of school teachers. Politicians. They were not particularly wealthy. James Madison promised everybody that he would keep their deliberations secret for 50 years until everyone had died, and he kept that promise. They weren't published until after his death, 50 years later. He was very young at the time. He was in his late 20s, early 30s. And the reason why, it turns out, is because they were betraying their class. They were betraying or in their opinions, they were betraying the wealthy people. So McDonald then went and looked at the...
Let's get to stop a second, Tom, because you just enlightened me with something that I didn't know. Because there were many times that I said some stark things about the founding fathers, but you're telling me that in as much as many of the founding fathers were really benevolent guys willing to go against their elitist class. Is that what did I understand that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure benevolent is, it might be a little too gushy, but yeah, they believed in democracy. They believed in this experiment. They practiced it in a very imperfect fashion, and they came from a rather bizarre time and that they were born into. And, I'm not here to justify, for example, slavery, which was the major sin of the era. But yes, and they were not the morbidly rich, and they weren't trying to create a country of, by, and for the morbidly rich. So then McDonald went and looked at the 13 ratifying conventions. Who showed up to ratify the Constitution in each one of these states in 1789. And what he found again was that the genuinely rich people in each one of the states opposed the Constitution. Patrick Henry is a great example. He was the richest man in Virginia. He was the largest slaveholder in Virginia. He held over 360 people in bondage. And he opposed the Constitution. At the ratifying convention, he stood up and spoke against it. In fact, James Madison modified the Second Amendment. I think you and I have talked about this when my book on guns came out.
Right.
Just to satisfy Patrick Henry's paranoia that a president might call up the Virginia militia, which was also their slave patrol, and thus, break the hold of slavery in the state. He changed the word nation to the word state in the Second Amendment. So, yeah, and what Forrest McDonald found was that in every single one of the 13 states, and I've got the information in my book, but you can also read his book. It was published in 1956. It's not in print any longer, but you can find used copies fairly easily. He found that in state after state, the people who were in favor of the Constitution were the people who were in debt, teachers, lawyers, which was not a well-paid profession in most cases, small subsistence farmers, and the people who opposed the Constitution were the genuinely wealthy people, particularly the industrialist class, which was just beginning to emerge, and people who had long associations with the British royal family and the East India Company. So, that's the history. I mean, you can look it up. It's bizarre how it gets danced around. I mean, I think I might have mentioned on Wikipedia, it says, George Washington's estate was worth $1 billion. He was a rich man in his time. And I'm like, No, it wasn't. I mean, he couldn't afford to free his own slaves. Land was cheap. So good.
It is important for us to know that, because, like I said, you come to the wrong conclusions about our democracy, and these folks that are running around with Trump right now. It's amazing how wrong they have it, from us being founded on the Christian nation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you have a chapter in the book called "Did Rich White Guys Create the United States Just to Guarantee Their Own Privilege, Power, and Slaves?"
Yeah, that's what you and I were just talking about. That
right. So I think, in effect, you and again, that is something that I think many progressives themselves would be out there. Not only conservatives would deny that, but progressives were out there talking a whole lot about that. Now, in this particular group of chapters, you talk about the way the country was structured democratically. Your thoughts on that? Because in all the studying that I've done and the reading of the Constitution, I find it a very flawed document. Personally, I'm no scholar, but I find it a very flawed document that I think all the compromises that were made actually made it not a democracy. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, keep in mind, they were trying something that had never before been done. The Roman Republic bore very little resemblance to us. I mean, they had an institution called the Senate. That's about it. The Greek democracy was organized in a completely different fashion. I mean, you had basically jury duty. Everybody had to serve for a year, 6,001 people to create a consensus, or to create I forget the name of the body, the Greek body. So this was a brand new experiment, and it was based largely on the Iroquois Confederacy, frankly, and I document that in some detail in the book. And they were trying to adapt that to a society that was not Iroquois, that was not a hunting gathering society or a marginally agricultural society. And there were a lot of compromises, admittedly. But, the point of democracy, I think the biggest point about democracy that I make in the book, and the biggest myth about democracy, particularly that gets promoted by conservatives, is that democracy is this weird thing that some smart people came up with, but it's not normal for humans. What's normal is the way Europe was for 1,000 years, where you got a king and you got the barons and then you got all the serfs, and that's what's normal. And that's really, what, if left to our own devices, we would recreate, because that's normal for humanity. And it turns out that's complete BS. And not just for humans, by the way. Back about a decade and a half ago, two British scientists, Roper and Conrad, proposed in an article in Nature that we would find that this mythology of the alpha animal in nature, that there's an alpha wolf and an alpha deer and an alpha elk, and that the alpha animal rules the herd, that would be completely false. That what we would find was that the alpha animal would have first selection of sexual partner, of mates, which comports with natural selection to pass along strongest genes. But that would be it. They would not be the decision makers. And James Randerson and a group of scientists put this to the test with a herd of red deer in the forest that was owned by a university at Essex in the UK, putting cameras in the trees and asking the question, when do the deer decide to go to which one of the three watering holes in this forest, and how do they make that decision? And it turned out that the deer would be grazing, and they would start pointing their bodies at one of the three watering holes, different deer. And when 51% of them were pointing at one of the water holes, the entire herd would kind of form and head to that watering hole. Democracy. Wow. So, in our Constitution, not only is it 50% plus one to pass laws and things like that, but for really difficult things like amending the Constitution, dangerous things, we require a supermajority. So what Randerson and his scientists did was they staked a predator near each one of the three watering holes and said, okay, now let's see what the deer do, And then what it took was 66% of the deer pointing at a particular watering hole to head to that watering hole. So, that supermajority exists in nature as well. So I called up Ken Conrad and I said, what happened when you published this in Nature? And he was like, oh, I got all this feedback. This bug guy called me up and said with gnats, ball of gnats in the air, like in the summer, and you see this ball of gnats and then it goes,
right,
like that. And how do they know when to move, right? Are they telepathic? No. With every wing beat, every gnat is voting. I'm going to move a little more to the left. And when 51% of them move a little more to the left, the whole ball moves to the left. He heard from a fish guy, and the ichthyologist. Yeah, this accounts for schooling behavior. Again, I always thought fish must be telepathic because there's not a lead fish going, hey, let's go to the right. I mean, at least with geese, they're honking at each other. You think maybe they're talking.
Right.
But, not fish. Well, it turns out they're not telepathic. Every motion is a vote. The same with birds flying and flocking. You'll see a flock of crows going across the sky, and suddenly they just go, yeah, like that. Well, how do they know to do that? Well, they're literally voting with every wing beat. And the conclusion that they came to in this study that ultimately was also published in Nature was that democracy is the default mode in all animals. I mean, from ants to primates. And the founders were particularly fond of this idea. They actually believed this to be the case, so much so that when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wrote, he was talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said this was the goal of nature's God. He talks about nature's God in the Declaration.
Right.
And he hands this off to John Adams to edit. John Adams, of course, was a Christian. John Adams scratches out nature's God and puts in the Christian God, right? And Jefferson gets it back and scratches out the Christian God and writes nature's God. And it's still there in the Declaration of Independence, nature's God. They believed that the natural state was small d democratic. And the goal was to have as much democracy as possible, which is why the first among equals, and they're not really equals, but the first among the three branches of the government, the first among the four parts of the three branches of the government was the House of Representatives, because it's the closest to people. The Senate then came out of a compromise, the big state, small state compromise. The presidency, the Electoral College, we can talk about that if you want. It's in the book, Why the Electoral College. But that was designed to try to avoid a president who was a scam artist, a hustler, a drunk, a person of low moral character, to quote Alexander Hamilton.
And but it turned out the opposite is what occurred, right?
Yeah, sadly. And then the Electoral College became an anachronism within 50 years of its creation because of the telegraph. And because of the Pony Express and things. But when they wrote the Constitution, the problem was, not only was there no telegraph, Ben Franklin was flying kites in thunderstorms. They didn't even have electricity. It was Leyden jar, and that was it. And so it could take 2, 3, and we didn't have a really comprehensive postal system at all. And so it could take 2, 3 weeks. It could take a month for a letter to make it from Georgia to Washington, D.C.
Right.
So how would a voter in Georgia know who to vote for president? There were no national newspapers. There was no telegraph. There's no radio or television. So what they came up with was that the Georgians would not vote for president. They would vote for people who were pledged to particular candidates for president, but they were actually voting for these electors. And the electors would then go physically to Washington, D.C., where on December 15th, they would cast their votes. And physically being in D.C., they would interview the candidates. And if they concluded that the people of Georgia had voted for a guy who was really a scoundrel, they wouldn't cast their vote for him, which is why you have, faithless electors. They literally wrote that in the Constitution. I mean, it was a great kind of safety valve protection system against a Donald Trump kind of person. But like I said, by the time the Pony Express and the telegraph came along, in the 1830s and 1840s, it was completely anachronistic. It was completely out of date. And we should have gotten rid of it 150 years ago. We almost did, by the way. We came within one vote in the Senate of getting rid of the Electoral College in the 1970s. In the 1970s. It was 74.
Okay.
I didn't have to go back and look.
It needs to go because, in as much as they did it for good purposes, in my opinion, again, it was never a real fail-safe, a real fail-safe. And look at what we've had. Every time that it misfired, for a particular kind of person. It's amazing.
George W. Bush and Donald Trump. Bush lost by half million.
Same kind of vote, right?
3 million. Yeah. Yeah. So it's time to get rid
You
of the
know,
Electoral College.
but I'm glad to hear that Nate, I speak a lot about most people being good, and in as much as most people being good, we just have these charlatanes out here that like Donald Trump and others. But my question then about democracy, and I want to go into something great about your book, is that a lot of times you write these books and it tells you about all the different problems that you have. What I like about your book is at the end of the book, you have an itemized list of solutions that we have to work towards if we want to maintain our democracy. But before we get there, I'd like to ask about how do we handle the mindset of people? Because that animals, which we are inherently democratic, but that we have allowed an autocratic streak because of being ill-informed and brainwashed. I guess animals don't get brainwashed because they don't have our intellect. How can we mitigate that, in your opinion? Because that is my task, your task, and the task of many doing this kind of work.
Well, and that was the founding generation's task, too. I mean, Jefferson repeatedly wrote, I do not trust the rich to protect this nation. I mean, he said that a half a dozen different ways at different times. And not only him, I mean, multiple founders trash talked the morbidly rich of their time. It's a real challenge. I mean, we've seen Jefferson identified three groups that were oppressive in the history of Europe, and that was warlords, people who conquered by force of violence, theocrats, popes typically, and the morbidly rich, the lords, the barons, and their goal in creating this document was to have the power derived, as the Declaration says, derived from the consent of the governed. And so with all of my solutions in the end of the book, they're all put in the context of, if the goal of American democracy, of our American republic, is to have something close to a democracy, the essence of a democracy is that what the majority of people want is what they get. And so if you look at, I mean, I don't think there's a single thing in my solutions chapter that doesn't poll well over 50%. And yet we don't have them for this reason that you just identified, which is we've been conquered. We've been conquered by the morbidly rich. And it really started in 1971. I mean, it has happened a couple of times in our history. The morbidly rich rose up in the 1830s. I think you and I talked about this when my book about American oligarchy came out.
Right.
The cotton gin and how that contributed to fewer than 2,000 families ending up completely controlling all the politics and economics of the South. And, we fought a civil war over that. Then you had the rise of the robber barons again in the 1880s, 1890s. And then there was, Teddy Roosevelt and the trust buster going after them. And then you had the morbidly rich rising again in the 1920s and leading to the Republican Great Depression. And then Franklin Roosevelt went after them. So by 71, the rich people had by and large excluded themselves from politics. And that's when Lewis Powell came along and said, if rich people and corporations don't get involved in politics, we're going to find ourselves on the outside looking in, because Ralph Nader is really popular and he's a communist, essentially. And he called him out. He calls out Ralph Nader in the Powell memo. That was in 71. In 72, Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. In 76, he voted on the Buckley decision, which said that bribing politicians shall no longer be called bribery because money is not money, it's speech, right? And in 78, he actually wrote the decision in the Buckley versus First National Bank, or the Bellotti versus First National Bank decision, or First National Bank versus Frank Bellotti, in which he said that not only is money free speech, but that corporations are persons and they're entitled to use free speech this way.
That was a killer. Oh, yeah.
And it was, and that the result of that was just a tsunami of mostly oil industry money flowing into the Republican Party and floating Ronald Reagan into the White House, as in reaction to Jimmy Carter creating a solar bank that would have had 20% of the nation's electricity being generated by the year 2000. Carter put that into place in 79, I think it was. And
he actually put the panels on the roof of the White House that Reagan summarily removed as soon as he got there.
That's right. That's right. And so, this was the beginning. There's another kind of backstory to it that I don't think is in this book. I think it's in my book on oligarchy. But in 1951, Russell Kirk wrote a book called The Conservative Mind, in which he argued that the American middle class was growing very rapidly. It was closing in on 50% of Americans at that time in 1951. It was in the mid 40s. And he said, if it ever reaches, there's some kind of a threshold here, probably well over 50%, where if the American middle class reaches that threshold, it will throw America into social chaos, because people who have never had money don't know how to handle money. People who have never had political power don't know how to handle political power. This is essentially the same argument that the Dixiecrats made about giving political power to Black people in the South, that it would be a dangerous, dangerous thing to do. And Kirk was considered a crackpot by most Republicans in 1951 when he published this book. William F. Buckley and Barry Goldwater thought he was a genius, but that was about it. But then came the 60s. In 61, the birth control pill was legalized, and within 3 years was widespread. And boom, you had the women's movement. You had the civil rights movement was growing like a weed in the 60s. In 64, you got the Civil Rights Act. 65, the Voting Rights Act. Martin Luther King and all of the various parts of the Black movement, the civil rights movement, and then you also had the war in Vietnam, and you had young men saying, "Hell no, I'm not going to go," which was exactly what Russell Kirk had predicted: that women would no longer know their place, that minorities would no longer know their place, and that even the children of the white upper class would start to rebel. And that's literally what happened in the 60s, what he predicted in 1951. Now, it didn't happen for the reasons that he predicted, that there was too big of a class. It happened for, exogenous reasons, other, external reasons, like, the development of the birth control pill. But it happened. And so in the 70s, that's why Lewis Powell wrote the Powell Memo. And that's why the mandate that Reagan had when he came into office in 1981 was to cut the middle class down to size. And when he came into office, the middle class was 2/3 of us. 1/3 of America had a good union job, which set the wage and benefit floor locally, so that 2/3 of Americans had the equivalent of a good union job and had a middle class where one wage earner could buy a home, buy a new car every 2 years, take a vacation every year, and have enough money left over for retirement and to put their kids through school. That was my family. That was my dad. He worked in a tool and die shop, and that was the life he had. Although he didn't put me through school, but that was the middle class. So Reagan set out to destroy the middle class to save America. And these guys really believed that they were saving America.
You know what, Tom? I think you give them a lot of credit. I wonder if they really want to save America. As one of the things that I say, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, because my contention is that they don't want a strong middle class. They don't want an educated people, because an educated people would ask about our economic system. Why would we work so hard for so little to ensure that so many get so much? In effect, they are all on our backs.
Yeah, that's the essence of the union movement. And that's what built the American middle class. And that's why when Reagan set out to destroy the middle class, the first thing he attacked was the union movement. And we went from 1/3 of Americans being unionized when he came into office to, by the time the Reagan-Bush 12 years was over, down to about 10%. I think we're around 6 or 8% in the private workforce now in the union movement. Crazy. So I think your analysis is right, but I don't think that they were sitting around saying, people will start questioning, like having Marxist analysis, economic analysis of power. No, they just didn't want people to have unions. They didn't want to have to pay people well. It was much simpler than that. But, a lot of among the theoreticians, the Buckleys and the Goldwaters, I really, having read their work and having, been steeped in their work when I was a kid, I really believe that they thought they were doing the best thing. I don't think that by the end of his term, Reagan thought he was doing the right thing, or the people around him. I think they just thought they were dancing to the tune of the really rich, who now own.
Are you saying you thought Reagan didn't think he was doing a bad thing? You think Reagan really thought he was saving the country?
I think he thought that at the beginning. I don't think, by the end, he was full-blown dementia, so who knows? But
yeah, right,
I don't think George Herbert Walker Bush thought that. I think he thought he was making America safe for aristocracy, because he was a member of the aristocratic class. His grandfather was the senator and the wealthy banker and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Anyhow, we don't have a lot of time here. So what I'm going to ask you to do, Tom, is if you can, you have a whole lot of solutions. And I think that's what this is all about, guys. The solutions that are here in the book. Why don't you give me your three tops?
Well, again, these are things that the majority of Americans want. And the only reason we don't have them is because the Supreme Court has legalized political bribery. So, I'd say to begin with, everybody in America should have health care. It should be part of the commons, and it should be administered by the government, or at least paid for by the government, single payer like Canada does. And it would cost half as much. And you wouldn't have, people like Dollar Bill McGuire, the guy who started, United Healthcare, who walked away with $1.4 billion. I mean, that's obscene. Every penny of that was taken from somebody, from saying to somebody, no, we won't pay for your liver transplant.
Exactly.
So number one, healthcare. Number two, education. What we learned from the GI Bill, which my dad went to college on. He only went for 2 years. My wife's dad went all the way through law school and ended up the assistant attorney general for the state of Michigan. And he came from a dirt poor, like literally no running water family. Is that the education is an investment. What we learned from the GI Bill was that for every dollar that the federal government invested in educating young people coming back from World War II, mostly young men, but nonetheless young people, was that we got $7 of return on investment in additional tax revenue, because educated people earn more and they stimulate the economy. And, there is no way that education is an expense. It's an investment. And that's why we are literally the only country on earth, or developed country on earth, where there's a student debt crisis. Every other country subsidizes higher education, like we did until 1980, or until the 1980s. I mean, Reagan ended free college in California as governor in the 70s, and then when he came into the White House, he cut. One of his first cuts was a 25% across the board cut to federal education support, and that began the gutting of the American public education system. So number two would be public education. I'd say number three, and it's a very vital one, is establishing an absolute right to vote, so that Republican governors can no longer purge you from the voting rolls. They can no longer make you stand in line for 12 hours. They can no longer make you jump through 16 different hoops. You automatically get registered as soon as you turn 18, like in every other democratic country in the world. We have these bizarre systems that are purely the result of rich people having been given the power to own politicians by a corrupt Supreme Court. So those are my top three.
The name of the book, the Hidden History of American Democracy. Read this, and I love the subtitle: Rediscovering Humanity's Ancient Way of Living. Rediscovering American Ancient Way of Living, from the New York Times best-selling author Thom Hartmann. Thank you so kindly once again, Thom. I revere your work. Thank you so kindly for being once again on Politics Done Right.
Thank you so much, Egberto, for inviting me. It's so nice talking with you. I appreciate it.
I always enjoy talking to Thom. Thom is a very knowledgeable guy, and he knows what he's talking about. Whoa, let's see. Thank you, Thom Hartmann and Egberto Willie. It's great hearing him. Yeah, thank you very much for listening, British MCP. Eric says, blue-collar workers that would pay someone's school loan is not rich, but Thom put that in there. Huh? Again, that's a false argument with folks, with the Republicans trying to tell blue-collar workers, as if they really like blue-collar workers, to say, blue-collar workers, you shouldn't be paying off those student loans of those lawyers. It's crap. The truth of the matter is, everybody gets a piece of the pie if the pie is allowed to be distributed appropriately. I don't see anybody complaining that Bill Gates made billions of dollars on other people's back, that Bill Gates actually got the software from somebody else, marketed it to IBM, made billions, and then called it his own. Nobody complained. But our economic system, that is how it was designed. It wasn't designed for intellect. It wasn't designed for what you're worth. It was designed for what you could steal from somebody else. It's that simple. And Bill Gates is not evil. Bill Gates is just playing the game better than anybody else in the capitalist system. A flawed game, but he knows how to play it, right? And some of us decide to play in the game, which, hey, I played in the capitalist game for quite a while. Made pretty damn good money. But in turning around and watching how things were for most Americans, not some Americans, but most Americans are just cogs in the game. And watching the game, I remember, And you guys can ask my wife and my daughter all the times. I would be complaining like hell. That's not fair. That's not fair, until I realized that even some of the way my profits were made with the with ComDRV and the different products that I sold, and I think I've showed you guys the over a dozen products that I created, both software and otherwise. I said, wow, you know what? As part of the problem, I have to be part of the solution as well. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Made me broke, but that's what I'm doing, why I'm doing. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing now. Because again, there are people who have to stand up and say that things have to change, and you don't have to be the recipient of the change to understand that you want things to change for the generation that's forthcoming. And that's what I believe. That's what a lot of us believe. That's why many of you support what we're doing here. Anyway, Bridge MCP said, today I heard from some conservatives that there is no book ban. It's just political conspiracy theories. That's a funny thing, right? They'll do the bad things, get called out for the bad things, and then no, it's only a conspiracy that's making you believe it's a bad thing. E2247 says, thank you for putting Tom on, Egberto. You're welcome. That's the purpose of this show. I have some other great interviews queued up from Netroots, including Keith Ellison. You're going to love the Keith Ellison interview. Keith Ellison, I still think, saved Minnesota from a bloody, bloody disaster that could have happened out there. But his measured approach to the way he handled the George Floyd case, I think qualifies him at some time to be the governor of Minnesota. All right, let's continue here. Let's see. Tom, why don't you pay someone's bills with your funds? He does. All of us do with our excess monies, right? I mean, what do you think when he's out there enlightening people? That's a part of payment, right? When you're helping make change in the country to allow other people to have equal access to success, you're paying your dues. The guy who's making $15 million off of your healthcare premiums, he isn't, but Tom is. So come on, let's get it right, folks. Let's get it right. Vamos a conseguirlo en una forma que está correcto. Let's do it in a form that is right. All right, what else have we got here? Peggy Lopez says, happily, the genie of oppression as necessary force is back in the bottle because of the Vietnam War, the women's movement, and the civil rights movement. The GOP cannot go back, but they're trying their utter best. They're trying their utter best. Bridge MCP, Stonewall in 1969, the riots that ensued sparked a global movement. In the movement, human rights orgs was formed, as was the women's right orgs, and the 60s was a big time for all rights, including, of course, the blacks' rights, etc. You're absolutely right about that. I'm scrolling up to all the comments. Eric Hayes, Bernie's been in Congress for 4 decades. He has his government salary and his book sales. Pelosi is a major problem in comparison. That is true, because she wouldn't even go against telling the Congress people they can't bet on stocks, right? She earned a lot of money from playing the stock market with insider information. This is a problem with something like 200 members of Congress. Yep, and Congress is the richest. I have a piece that I saw from these guys that showed that how rich they really are. It is amazing, people. It is amazing. All right, what else have we got here? Daniel Ledoa has the nerve to say Tom makes up history. I suggest you read one of his books. And one of the things, unlike my books, which because I'm lazy, I do all the research, but I don't go ahead and do some of the work Tom does. I want to show you what Tom does. Tom has a Hellified Index in all of his books that also gives you a bibliography of all the items that he purports in his book. So when you read his book, you can always go and say, let me see where he got that information from. And it's all here. I don't do that. I work on the assumption that, okay, I wrote the book. You know the work that I do. I'm not going to lie to you. But you can still research it. With Google now, look, this is a great way to do it, right? But Tom has about, let's say, that's 154. What's this page here? About, 50 pages or so. about 30 something pages of bibliography and all that kind of stuff. I rather cut the pages and keep the price a little bit cheaper on the page count. If you don't believe something in my book, Google is always there to go look it up. But I condense a lot of these things in my books. But, you know, what can I say? All right. We got Daniel Ledo. Thom Hartmann has more American history than you. I swear your knowledge amounts to American mythology and nothing else. You know, I mean, unfortunately, Rodnin, and it's not Ledo's fault, but most of us are living the American mythology. You know, we go across thinking the Pilgrims were benevolent and they lived in harmony with the Indians, the natives, and that the only time they reacted on the natives was when the natives did something wrong or whatever, not realizing that, no, that's not what happened at all. We came here, we saw good land, we wanted, or I'm talking about the people who came from Europe, wanted the land and they just took it. They signed treaties, they disregarded the treaties. They find gold on land that was already treated to the indigenous folks here, and when they found gold on it, they took it. So we ought to be, and I said this to one of our callers today in the morning show. We have a tendency to have this belief that we are so different than the rest of the world. We are the ultimate democracy. We believe in such a great morality. All these things we like to talk about. But what we fail to acknowledge is that the rest of the world also knows our history. And if for those of us who know our history, I'm not talking about our mythology as Rudnan just said, but those of us who know our history know that it's far from perfect. So when this guy called in and we were contrasting what America is doing in the world and what China is doing in the world, at this current time in our history, the militant country is the United States. I mean, you don't see China going around the world bombing stuff. You don't see China going around the world giving ultimatums to third world countries. What you do see China doing is working behind the scenes, and I'm not saying they're doing it for being nice. They're doing it for political power and influence. But in the process, people are not dying for that, right? They're building roads in third world countries. Yeah, they are exchanging it for resources, etc. But it's an exchange, right? Jamaicans can get from one side of the island to another side of the islands very, very quickly for a freeway that was sort of in a joint venture with China. Go to Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, all these other places where China is building. They're not giving ultimatums and dropping bombs, right? What I'm trying to say here is let's take off the colored glasses and understand what's going on in the world. Let's be very cognizant of how the rest of the world sees us. Yeah, China is buying up Africa. There's no doubt about it. But they're not doing it at the barrel of a gun. You see? Remember how Belgium did Congo, right? Remember how the Portuguese did Brazil and all these other places. They didn't negotiate as they stole. They plundered and killed. There is a difference. So when we talk about which nation has the propensity to kill the most, to attain the most, we are no saints in this game. And unless we are surely, and the thing about it is this, the rest of the world knows this. The only people that don't know these realities are we in this country, because our history lies to us, and when we start telling true history, the other side try to say you're trying to be woke. Well, yep, I cop to it. I do want to be woke. Daniel Edo says, remember what the Tutsi did to the Hutu? Yes, I do. Remember what the white slave master did to the slaves? What's the difference again? Please tell me, Daniel Edo, what's the difference? The Hutus and the Tutsis, They had their war. They sliced each other up with a machete, and it was over. Slavery lasted several hundred years with people getting skinned alive, balls being cut off, people being whipped, families being separated. And even in the 1960s, 1970s, we still had redlining, we still had Jim Crow to some effect, and we still have Jim Crow coming back, Mr. Ledo. You want to tell me which one is more violent, which one is more evil? Let's talk about it, Ledo. You know, when you're pointing fingers, watch how many are pointing back. 10,000 Panamanians died when we decided that we wanted to get Noriega because Noriega didn't want to invade Nicaragua. Or was it El Salvador? I think it was Nicaragua. So we decided to finally take him up on financing drugs for the cartel. So we decided that we could go into a sovereign country and extract a leader out of there. Now, for the countries that think we are doing bad things in their country, like extracting the wealth under duress, could they come here and extract our president? I don't think so. But we do that. So before you start criticizing other countries about how evil they are or the things that they do or the killings that they perform, let's be cognizant of what we do. Let's be very cognizant of what we do. Before we start worrying about whether Russia is going to use a nuclear bomb or whether China is going to use a nuclear bomb, let's start thinking about, well, there's only one country who's ever used it. We were. There are several other countries that have it that we don't complain about. Brazil and Israel and others have the bomb. Do we really go ahead and say, let's make sure that they're doing that? Let's go into their foreign affairs because they have the bomb? Every country that has the bomb know that once it is used, there is going to be repercussions. That's it. Egberto Willis, you're going to play Supreme Court rulings a winner for Democrats. I actually don't have a video for that. What I have is just I was just going to talk about it. That was a filler in case you guys didn't bring up enough subjects or issues. You know, what was the word that I wanted to say? But yeah, where did I find that article? I think it was at Common Dreams, and I have that article here about the Supreme Court. And let's see if I can find that and talk a little bit about it. All right, here it goes. This is the article that I want everybody to read. I'm going to put it up on the screen. Here it goes. Poll confirms Supreme Court reform is surefire politically. In other words, if Democrats and progressives play their cards right. Hello, Tom. How are you doing? I actually agree with Eric Hayes. China is leveraging debt over poor countries for their natural resources. Oh, I agree with that. That's what China is doing. But my contention was, Tom, that while China is leveraging debt over these countries, in other words, let's put it this way. You know what a reverse mortgage is? I disagree with reverse mortgage, etc. But what it is it's taking your assets and giving you cash out of it. China is building freeways and all of that, monetizing these people's natural resources. The thing incumbent on these people is to ensure that the monetization of said resources is done relatively fairly, right? I want you to. Guys, you go read the polls on the Supreme Court reform. It's up on the screen. And let me go ahead and put the link in the thing because, Tom, I want to address what Tom said because what Tom said is very important. Because two things can or don't have to be mutually exclusive. China is going into other countries, leveraging their resources, building freeways, giving them debt to let's call it modernize these countries. Let's just call it that, right? The thing is that it is incumbent on these countries to make a deal, a good deal. Now, there are several options, right? There are some African countries that are trying to create the United States of Africa, where they create their own sovereign currency and they monetize all their resources in the aggregate. That is one concept. And in fact, that is a preferred concept, right? That means you can get away from the exploitative nature of the capitalism of the West if you did that. But there are two things here. I can almost guarantee you, any day, any African country that starts to be successful in getting that put together, I can guarantee you that person will get killed, or there would be a war or something to prevent that. Because again, the West has always extracted from Africa raw material and then reverse it back into cooked materials, right? And it just isn't fair, but that's what has happened over time. I don't have enough time. I just realized that we are really out of time. But Thom, you gave me a subject that we need to cover. China's approach to exploiting the third world, if you will, versus America's approach. America's approach is usually, I'll tell you what to do, and if you don't do it, I'll bomb you to smithereens. And the Chinese way, when was the last time you heard of a Chinese aircraft bombing anything? Their way is to use their financial power that they partially got from our oligarchs to go ahead and build around the world. They build goodwill, they build influence, and for all those who say, well, they put a lot of these nations in debt, there's one thing to remember. If these nations don't pay their debt, what can China do? Not a darn thing other than trying to say we'll go invade the country and forcefully extract the resources. How many nations can they invade? So there's a whole lot of things that we can cover from there that we'll need to do. So anyhow, look, I went over time. I went into my talking modal. I hope you enjoyed at least the talking modal. Let me ask you something, guys, because earlier Breach said, Egberto, what about the other subject? I come to the program with several subjects, not intent on necessarily going through every subject if you guys change the direction of the topics. Like how Thom said something that I wanted to comment on extensively, as well as a few others. Do you prefer that, or do you want me to stick to the script? I prefer your script than my script. So let me know what you prefer. Let's take a little vote. Make you guys continue to, whenever I have the main subject and I put it out, don't you prefer to be able to change the subject or not? Let me know. Say yes or no. Yes, that you guys rule, or no, that I stick to whatever subject I want to do. Mixed videos you're going to share, then check the comments in between the videos. There you go. And then the thing about it is many times I can't get it all done, but that tells me I'm not doing it wrong. Okay. Anyway, folks, thank you, Redden, for the advice, which is what we do right now. I got to get out of here. My name is Egberto Willies. This is Politics Done Right. And you guys know how I end this baby. I end it this way. I am what? Out.
Welcome to Politics Done Right. I am your host, Egberto Willies. This is a progressive program that will take mystery out of politics. This is the program that will encourage you to make sure government becomes we the people. Whether you are liberal, progressive, conservative, or otherwise, you get your point of view. We are an independent media outlet that, like mainstream media, beholden to corporations, we only owe allegiance to you. Remember, you can also send a tweet at EGBRTOWILLIES. That is at Egberto Willies. Let us engage. It is Politics Done Right.